I do have to ask, is the beta facing the correct way for you and just not for me?
No, it looks fine this way well, for us.
That's good. For me, it's backwards, and that probably isn't what we want. I like that everybody here is early. We'll just wait until 6 o'clock to start. So feel free to, grab your dinner, grab some water.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Emily. We're just hanging out until 6 p.m.
Yep, I've presentation looks good. I've got a backup if you need.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was going to change my name to Emily Farmer, but then I thought I'd probably log off the beta Zoom and forget to change it back. So,
It's pretty easy.
yeah,
Um,
maybe I will. Somebody else logs in as Emily Farmer. At least it's a nice name.
there you go.
Right, so it is 6 p.m. We'll wait a few more minutes to really begin, but as we're sort of getting started here, welcome to our Hazard Mitigation Plan Update public meeting, everybody. My name is Emily Farmer. I'm from the consultant working on this project, Beta Group. With me is also the other Emily Slatnick. If you want to introduce yourself, go ahead, Emily.
Hi, all. Emily Slatnick, Beta Group. I'm the climate resilience manager and the project manager for this project. Thanks, Em.
No problem. So we're going to go through a presentation today, and there are going to be a few opportunities for people to unmute themselves, ask questions, or type questions in the chat. As we begin here, it would be great if everybody could introduce themselves if you feel at ease to do so. Don't feel obligated. Let us know who you are, where you're from, if you're a member of our Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee or not. That would be helpful too.
Yeah, Emily, it actually might help if you just go and call people out and ask them to unmute, since everyone's got a different view of who lines up where on the screen.
This is true. Yeah, that's true. If you feel more comfortable in chat, feel free to do so, but I'll go down the line. Just, feel free to unmute yourself. Charlie, we'll start with you because you are to the left of me.
I'm Charlie Seelig. I'm the town administrator in East Bridgewater.
Nice to meet you, Charlie. Liz, you are next on the list.
Liz Shea, Assistant Town Planner, Town of Abington.
Thanks, Liz. John, go ahead. John Nuttall.
Hi, John Nuttall, the Abington Fire Chief. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie, go ahead. Stephanie Danielson.
Stephanie Danielson. I'm the Director of Planning and Economic Development for the town of Easton.
Thank you, Stephanie. John Carroll, you are next on the list.
Hey, John Carroll, I'm the Deputy Fire Chief in Easton.
Thanks, John. Joe Borman, you are next.
I can speak. Joe may not want to. Joe is from Easton Community Access TV.
Amazing. Nice to meet you, Joe. Abington Cam, feel free to introduce yourself.
Yep, it's Kevin Tachi. I oversee operations at Abington Community Access and Media, and I am capturing this for anybody who might want a record or copy of this, and also if they want to air it on their local access channels to share with the communities.
Thank you. Sarah Blackadder, you're next.
Hi, Sarah Blackadder from the Stoughton Fire Department. I'm the office manager there.
Thank you, Sarah. Jean White, you're next to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jean White. I am the executive assistant at the Abington DPW.
Thank you, Jean. Lindsay Wright, you are next.
I am the public health nurse in Abington.
Thanks, Lindsay. Paul Bunker, go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. Paul Bunker. I am the Abington Conservation Commission Chairman.
Thank you, Paul. Timothy Vamosi.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Oops, sorry. There we go. Captain Tim Vamosi with the Easton Fire Department, the public health liaison, and also a member of the Easton Finance Committee.
Thanks, Timothy. Becky, you are next. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Becky McFawn. I'm just an Abington resident.
Thanks, Becky. We appreciate it. Sean Riley, you're next.
Sean Riley, another Abington resident, town moderator, and real estate attorney.
Good to hear it. Thank you, Sean. Zoom user is next. I'm not sure if that's their name. Yeah, that's okay. We can move on. Judy's iPhone after that. Not sure if Judy's last name is iPhone.
Judy Kelleher, Abington resident.
Thank you, Judy. And then A.H. Benson is next. That's okay. Again, we can come back to you. Cheryl Snyder, who just joined, we're just going through and introducing yourself. If you feel comfortable doing so, feel free to unmute yourself and introduce who you are and where you're from.
I'm coming 1 second. Just
No
got
problem.
Yeah. Hi. So I complete with just took the trash barrels out. So I live in Abington. My name is Cheryl Snyder. I've been here since 2014, actually 2015, and I'm very interested in our plan for hazard mitigation. Thank you.
Good to
I'm a
hear.
social
Thank
worker
you.
by trade.
Oh,
Thanks.
awesome. Thank you. And then I think Joe may have unmuted themselves. If they want to introduce themselves. But again, if not, that's okay. Okay, awesome. Well, it's very nice to meet everybody. The joys of virtual meetings is that we can gather all 4 towns here together. As we go, feel free, especially to my co-hosts, to have people introduce themselves in the chat as more people join. I'm unable to see chat as I'm screen sharing. So if somebody has a question or introduces himself, feel free to shout me out as that occurs. And to those of you who are here, feel free to use that chat to talk amongst yourselves, to ask questions, things of that nature. We'll be using that function a little bit later on, but since there's not too many of us, it'll probably also be nice to have everybody unmute when we get to those discussion portions, if you feel comfortable doing so. So it is 6:06. We may have added a few more people to our list, but with that, let's begin with talking about this hazard mitigation plan update. For all 4 of these towns, Abington, East Bridgewater, Easton, and Stoughton. I'm just going to go over a little bit about what we're going to go over today, because there's a lot going on. We're going to start about, what is hazard mitigation planning? What are the benefits of it? How does it work? And then we're going to go through the process that we're actually going through right now in this plan, how we do the risk assessment. There'll be a chance to interact there, how we establish goals and identify the projects and actions that will help make our towns better. We'll interact there too. And then we'll talk about how to maintain this plan that we're currently writing. And then of course, we'll have time for questions and conversations and whatever is next on the list for us. I do want to take a second. They did introduce themselves earlier if you were here to see so, but we do have a core planning team. The core planning members are members of our hazard mitigation planning committee. There are a lot of members of the hazard mitigation planning committee from each town, but these core committee members were sort of our direct point of contact and continue to be our direct point of contact between Beta and each town individually. So Liz, Stephanie, Charlie, and Sarah, thank you so much for your work so far. And Emily, of course, thank you as well. So just a big thank you for you guys as we get on with this. There will be more work to do. We're going to begin with talking a little bit about the planning process. So the FEMA sort of gives us a list of all of the things we need to put into hazard mitigation plans. We need to meet with the public consistently. We need to draft plans for review, which we'll go over that process. And then, we send that out to each town for their review, for public review. Then we send that to the Massachusetts Emergency Agency for their review. They send it back to us with comments, we resubmit it, and then they submit it to FEMA so that we can get notes from them, and then finally get that local adoption and FEMA approval. So there's a lot of sort of formal steps that go into this. I think, as we're currently in this public meeting stage, we're developing those mitigation strategies. We're asking you for your public comment. We want to get that input from the public to make this plan as sort of personal as possible to each town. Remember that there are live websites on your town's pages as we speak for all the information there. There's actually also still a survey up if you haven't filled it out so far. We said that it ended on the 31st of December, but I lied and kept it open a little bit longer just to be a catch-all for anybody else who'd like to add their opinions. I know we have a lot of responses from each town. Stoughton, I will call you out. You may need to pick up the pace a little bit. It's not a competition, but it is a competition. So feel free to check out that survey that is on each website for your town, and maybe on flyers around your town as well, and on each town's social media as well. So this isn't your only chance to add that public input. That survey is a great place to do so. And our second public meeting, which will be held much farther down the line in this project, will also be a great place to do that. So we probably should have done this in the beginning, but let's sort of take it back a step and ask, what is hazard mitigation? Hazard mitigation is any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural hazards. And so we're talking about planning processes, we're talking about structural processes, infrastructure, protection of wildlife, protection of people, protection of our systems in place in each town. And it's required that every town updates their hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. That's required federally. So these 4 towns have joined together for this iteration of their plan. And so we hope that in the next 5 years, they will come back to this plan with some success and maybe some thoughts to redo this plan like we're doing right now. There's sort of a whole cycle of emergency management. Hazard mitigation is part of this cycle. And it's the one that happens, it's the part that happens proactively before a disaster takes place. So we're sort of within mitigation and preparedness. Hazard mitigation is also related to climate resilience. We'll be talking a lot about climate change this evening. And both climate resilience and hazard mitigation sort of consider how future events will impact each town and try to minimize losses by making smarter present day decisions to lessen those impacts from the future. So hazard mitigation and climate resilience will come up quite a bit this evening. It's a little hard to tell the difference between hazard mitigation and preparedness. They are both separate, but they're also together. They're not mutually exclusive concepts. An example would be for emergency shelters, thinking about perhaps the accessibility or the use of an emergency shelter. Planning for that emergency shelter may be implemented as part of a hazard mitigation plan, while like the physical stocking or preparation of an emergency shelter might be considered more preparedness. So we've learned what hazard mitigation is, the basis of the process at least. What is this all for? So hazard mitigation planning helps to serve as a guide for decision makers and for residents on how to improve a town's resilience in the face of these natural hazards and in the face of climate change. And an added benefit is that it provides lots of mitigation grant opportunities for each town. Some grants will only be awarded to towns who have hazard mitigation plans. Hazard mitigation assistance grant window opens in June every year. There are hazard mitigation grant programs, filtered through MEMA. And so to take advantage of those grants for in-town projects, having a hazard mitigation plan is really important. We talked a little bit about this, but outreach and coordination is also very important for these hazard mitigation plans. FEMA has really expanded how much they look into participation as a whole. And so municipalities and residents are required pretty much to participate in these planning efforts. So here's a little overview of the planning or the outreach that we have done and will continue to do for this project. We have some committee meetings that are virtual. We're doing some community outreach. You'll see that consistently on the sort of Facebook pages and town pages for each of your towns. We'll have 2 public meetings, presentations. This is the first of those. The second will be sort of a draft review down the line. And then we'll continue to submit and gather those edits from MEMA and FEMA. Of course, the survey sort of has already happened and is currently happening. Again, check out your town websites for that as well. And another thing we have to consider in these hazard mitigation plans, which we've talked about as well, I told you it would come up, here it is climate change and climate resiliency. There's no greater threat to the health of our towns, especially in Massachusetts, but also elsewhere, than climate change. It's a fundamental factor when we're considering how to develop these hazard mitigation plans. And we can view almost all of the natural hazards that we look into through the lens of climate change. It's present in sort of every aspect of our work. The state of Massachusetts is sort of a leader on this front. The 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan was one of the first to include climate resiliency and climate change as something that really needed to be focused on in hazard mitigation plans. So this hazard mitigation planning process is a really good chance for each of these 4 towns to really adhere to that 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan and to those values of climate resiliency. So just a couple of examples, ideas from a Georgetown Climate Center report, identifying some good ideas for climate resilience. Numbers 1 and 2 might be considered some of the overarching goals of hazard mitigation planning, maybe this hazard mitigation plan as well, and the rest could be potential mitigation actions or strategies. So I've given you the overview, and soon we'll have a chance for you to incorporate your thoughts here. We're going to begin with how does this process really work when we get down to it? How does the planning process work? We'll explain the overarching structure here. We're going to begin with risk assessment. The risk assessment identifies what hazards might affect towns in Massachusetts and analyzes each of those hazards with sort of the focus on where each hazard might affect a planning area, the extent of that natural hazard, how often those events have happened in the past or might happen in the future, and what parts of each community are most likely to be affected. We also then go into the strengths, the capabilities that each town has. What are the planning measures in place? What are the infrastructural benefits in place from each town? And what areas are the most vulnerable to the impact of these natural hazards? We take a look at the critical facilities of each town, and we'll show you all this as we go. What are the important structures, the important processes that are critical for town operation? We're going to begin with this whole risk assessment idea with talking about what is a natural hazard. Our first step in this process is to identify the natural hazards that impact each town. And a natural hazard is a condition, an event that can cause loss or damage to people, environment, buildings, infrastructure, or the economy. It's important to note that we are only focusing on natural hazards. So nothing like the EMP, I can't remember if that's what it's called, but something that shuts down all the technology, that's not something we're going to consider. We also don't consider pandemics like SARS-CoV-19. So that is something to consider. So here is the first chance for you to interact here. Again, feel free to use the chat or to unmute yourself and think about your neighborhood. We give you a list, some example natural hazards. Have any of these hazards impacted you? How? When did they impact you? Have you seen some of them a lot? Have you never seen some of them? So I will ask you to put your input in now, and I will find where your videos are. There they are. Okay. Again, feel free to do so in the chat as well. Thanks for that link, Emily. Sure, the federal law that mandates this work. Emily, you might have to correct me here, but I believe it's the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. That's good that I remembered that. In a couple of our publications, we've sent that out, but it requires the hazard mitigation planning take place and then sort of mandates that 5-year timing.
So just going to jump in here and fill the void a bit and try to encourage folks to chime in here. I challenge, put the question a different way. Has anyone ever been detoured on your way to work or on your way to a kid's sporting event because there was a tree down in the middle of the road? Have any of you lost power during a major storm event and been unable to work from home, maybe during the pandemic? Anyone had trouble with ice freezing on dead trees coming down in your yard, maybe close to a power line?
Yeah, Cheryl says in North Abington, we were losing electricity often in the past 5 years during storms. That's something we've seen across Massachusetts, actually. The state of trees, knocking down power lines, things of that nature. Stephanie and Liz both mention winter storms and severe storms and extreme amounts of snow, severe storms with loss of power. So again, that theme of loss of power. I'm looking forward to our next winter storm. I mean that very sarcastically, but can't wait to clean my car off. Oh, Cheryl also says that drought has impacted Abington as well this past summer. Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Jason Sutton, I'm the chair of the Town of Easton Commission on Disability, and thank you for putting this together. And I enjoyed hearing what you're discussing. I apologize. I'm going to have to leave early for another meeting. I wish I could stay for the whole thing, but before I leave, I just wanted to make sure, and I don't want to go too off topic, but just wanted to see what considerations have been made for people with disabilities in these situations, like people who are hard of hearing or have cognitive deficits or not as mobile, that type of stuff, or deaf. But yeah, I was just curious about that.
Yeah,
Jason,
that's a-
can I ask, just to clarify, are you asking about how that, how these considerations are incorporated into the hazard mitigation plan?
Yeah.
Sure. And do you want to answer this?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so, one of the areas that we look at in the planning process, and Emily will talk a little bit about this in a minute, is vulnerability. So we assess the vulnerability of structures, we assess the vulnerability of elements of the environment, and we also assess vulnerability of various social elements. So a lot of times in the planning we do in New England, we spend a lot of time in these plans talking about senior citizens, such a large part of our population. And the way we speak of vulnerability, in many cases, it has to do with limited mobility, limited access to transportation. Some seniors aren't in a position to be driving. And so there's a lot of sort of commonality, and we end up being able to discuss vulnerability for those other factors that are present for other individuals and other members of the community. So lack of access to a car, lack of access to internet, or maybe lack of familiarity or comfort using computers. So all of that goes into the vulnerability assessment and considerations in terms of vulnerability. What it really often gets incorporated into the mitigation strategies along the lines of emergency management. And so that's where there's this nexus that Emily already discussed. We're not writing a new emergency management plan, but we will ask, does the emergency management plan account for different populations? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I offered or just threw that out there anyway.
Yeah, certainly.
I think the biggest thing that comes to mind, and I know there's resources out there, is, if there's an emergency, do emergency personnel, is there a way for them to know who is the most vulnerable and to give them the primary attention, when something is occurring, that type of a thing. Maybe they can look in a registry, or maybe that we have a record of some kind of people who are the most vulnerable. That was kind of the main thing that came to my mind. So I wasn't sure if it encompassed that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And again, it is a question that comes up a lot in doing these plans. We often have your town's emergency manager as a member, if not the chair of the local hazard mitigation planning committee. So they'd be the best person to answer that. This plan is not going to change the answer to that situation, but what it can do, and this is a great example, is ask the question. If you don't know how to find out the answer to that question, it might mean that your emergency management plan isn't publicly accessible, and maybe that's because it hasn't been updated frequently. So that's one of the things that might come out of this plan is a recommendation to say, hey, let's look at your emergency management plan and make sure that it is accounting for today's demographic in town, and make sure it is asking these questions and providing resources in the case of emergency.
Yeah, I think the fire chief might be the director emergency management designee. Could be wrong though. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate the input.
Thanks for the question.
If I can quickly just speak to a lot of the trainings that are happening right now within public health, and having a seat, being a part of this process, being the public health nurse. A lot of our training is speaking to access and functional needs. which speaks directly to exactly what you were asking for. So that is something that is always, for me sitting at this table, something that is always at the forefront of looking at these plans and the vulnerability of different populations. So I know, and most people who are going through any training at this point right now, access and functional needs is a huge component of any new training. So it's not something that's being left behind at all.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, and feel free to, use us as a resource if you need some local feedback, on any particular parts of it. But
Yeah,
makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks both Jason and Lindsay. It's great. It's really good to hear from different parts of the community. I like to sort of think as hazard mitigation plans as sort of a basket, a picnic basket, one might say, where you take different aspects out, and one of those aspects is emergency management. One of those aspects is the fire department. One of that is the Commission on Disabilities, public health nurse. So we sort of want to compile all of those aspects of each town, how they can improve on this hazard mitigation front, and the strengths that they already have into one plan. So it's good to hear from different parts of each town. Yeah, okay, awesome. So we've heard a little bit about drought too in the chat here. Some of you might start thinking even more about drought when we start to see those, and have already seen those impacts of climate change. So we will definitely be incorporating these comments that you have. Japanese knotwood as well. We do talk about invasive species here, so it's good that you mentioned that as well. If you have any more comments on what you've seen in your neighborhoods, feel free to mention street names, feel free to mention neighborhood names. Feel free to put that in the chat or call me out. I'm always happy to be interrupted most of the time. But we'll move on here. Whoops. Or we'll move really far on and confuse everybody. Okay. So all those natural hazards identified on the previous slide were the natural hazards that we identified for this plan. Any event, physical condition has potential to cause damage in many forms. Lots of communities have begun to organize their hazard mitigation plan by climate change impact, sorting those related natural hazards under sort of three major categories: changes in precipitation, rising temperatures, extreme weather, and then those non-climate influence hazards like earthquakes. And so it really helps to categorize how we look at these hazards and how we look at how they're going to change in the future. So we do express in the plan some of the predicted climate change impacts and try to plan for those as well, because it's going to happen. I'm going to take you on sort of a rating journey here. Take a look at these ratings, get a sense of what maybe Abington is most at risk to. We have one of these for each town, so don't worry, your town will appear. These ratings are based on a scale that includes a measure for the frequency, so how often a hazard event occurs, and also how often it might occur in the future. The location and size of each event, so how much of an area it impacts, and then the severity and damage of that event, how much damage it could cause. It's a relative scale. They're all sort of ranked differently. But it's good to notice some of the consistencies we see across each town. You'll notice that hurricanes and tropical storms are consistently potentially the most damaging and most likely to occur. Winter storms at a close second, in fact, an equal second. And so we want to understand which populations, which infrastructure, what systems are most vulnerable during these events. So we also take a look at historic events. How often have these events occurred? What are some specifics within each county, within each town? Easton again, those hurricanes and winter storms. Extreme temperatures also on the rise here. And then Stoughton as well. Does anybody disagree with these rankings? I think maybe drought is the most dangerous, actually. I'll take that as a no. But it's very interesting to look at. Yeah, just because, earthquakes might have a critical rating in damage doesn't make them more dangerous or less dangerous. Of course, it's all relative to, say, a severe storm, which might have limited damage on a town. So I think that's just really interesting to think about as we move forward here. The next part of our risk assessment is our vulnerability assessment. This is a map of Abington here with the critical facilities very small on there, but I promise you they are there. So we're going to take a look at, with our hazards of concern identified, we're going to look at the local vulnerability. So what populations, what areas of town, what specific infrastructure is most at risk from the impacts of these hazards. What do we predict our sort of suffering, the damage to be if we do nothing at all to mitigate risk? So we'll take a look at the critical facilities, the facilities that help the town to function, help the town to run. And here we map them against the flood zones. So the 100-year and 500-year flood zones, areas that have generally a more potential for flooding. And we like to see where those intersect. Are there important dams, important utility structures in those floodplains? If so, what can we do to mitigate the damage that might occur there? So we have one of these maps for every town. Again, I'm not going to show you all of them, but I promise they're all in there. After identifying those critical facilities, we also want to take a look at the strengths that each town has, the capabilities that each town has. We ask, what tools do we currently have at our disposal to reduce our exposure, our vulnerability, or the severity of impact of each hazard? How do we buy down our risks to these hazards? When we look into things like planning and regulatory strengths, administrative and technical strengths, because we want the capacity to apply how previous completed actions or plans may have turned into capabilities, strengths that we can use in this plan. If a town has a dedicated fund for water-related projects, it could be an asset in developing a stronger and more efficient stormwater system. We want to think about the flood risk with drinking water and sort of the 4 town water systems here. We have two towns using well water. We have 2 towns using municipal water. How will those be impacted differently in a severe flooding event or in a drought? And so we look at all of these previous documents, plans, funding opportunities that each town has at its disposal, and try and, make a plan for how these already existing capabilities can help to make a plan for the future. Okay, we've assessed risk. There's a lot of risk assessment. That's definitely sort of the heftiest of all 4 parts of this hazard mitigation plan. We're sort of wrapping it up right now. There will always continue to be more things that pop up in our risk assessment that we'll need to incorporate back in there. But then we take sort of all of that assessment we've done and turn it into the establishment of goals. Each town is going to review their goals from the 2015 plan. It was actually all regional goals in the 2015 plan to make sure that they still align with our current plan. Most of them will, most likely. We'll take a look at these, maybe change some wording, and also make them more specific to each of these 4 towns, because the 2015 previous plan incorporated, I believe, 15 municipalities instead of just 4. So there definitely going to need to be some specificity in these goals. And we want to translate these goals into feasible actions, which will be our next step. We do want these sort of goals to guide us through the actual action-making process. For example, in the 2015 plan, East Bridgewater, calling you out, had an action to create a list of all town-owned properties noting any vulnerability and prioritizing the need to address said vulnerability. We can look at that action and say that it aligns pretty well with goals 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we want all of our actions at the end of the day to somehow align with these goals, as well as align with our risk assessment, align with the hazards that we discussed previously. Lots of words on this page. Don't feel like you need to read them all. Those of you who are on the committee, you will need to read them all. So keep that in mind. Goal setting, because we have that previous plan, is one of the shorter actions that we take in this planning process, because we can work off those previously made goals. And actually, the strategies and actions, the mitigation actions, are similarly, in theory, easier to complete because we do have a list of actions from that previous 2015 plan that we can build off of. We have this foundation of our risk assessment and our goals. How do we move forward here? We're going to identify mitigation strategies. Strategies, I like to say, are the blueprint of the actions the losses identify, whereas, mitigation actions are those direct actions that each town can take, the specific projects to address those vulnerabilities. We like to separate our mitigation actions into these categories: planning and prevention, property protection, natural resource protection, structural projects, emergency services, and public education and awareness. So we hope that a lot of the actions that we'll identify will adhere to those, and we'll have at least one action per town in each of those categories to make it more of a holistic strategy going forward. So we will have our second chance for your input this evening.
I'm just going to jump in quickly,
Yeah.
Emily, because I want to, if you go back to that last slide before we get into this question, I want to point out that there are frequently actions in a hazard mitigation plan that cover multiple categories. And these are FEMA categories that we recycle here. So it's really easy to see how you might have a project that does both planning and prevention and natural resource protection, for instance, or public education and awareness and emergency services. So now going into this next exercise, I just want to let folks sort of be creative and know that you don't need to fit within a specific box.
Yeah, definitely not one or the other. Okay, we've discussed potential hazards, areas of populations at risk, the existing strengths we've noted on. Thinking of all those things, what are some actions that you maybe have suggested before, or you've heard people suggest, or you come up with off the top of your head that might help to solve the issues that we see that hazard mitigation might help with? I'm opening the chat. As you begin thinking, I do have some examples, so you're not just sort of wading through the information. I actually have an example from each town. So again, feel free to cut me off if you think of something. But one of our actions for, oh, I see some raised hands. I'm going to say this action and then I'll call on you. One of the actions for Abington in the 2015 plan was work with the state to enlarge several culverts on Route 18 in need of replacement and or upgrades. I don't know if Jason, your hand is still raised from previously, or if you have an idea. Either way. Okay. John, go ahead. John Nuttall.
I thank you. John Nuttall, Abington Fire Chief. I'm just going to try to hit a few broad categories that I saw pop up here from some of our residents, and I think it'll affect a lot of them as well. So most of the hazards that we're seeing, and I think it was the top 2 across all 4 towns, from the storms, whether it's a winter storm or a hurricane, summer type warm storm, really has to do with power lines down, trees down, taking power lines, which the trees obviously shut down the infrastructure, our ability to get around, but that really is ultimately compromised by the power lines that get entangled with those trees. So we can't just clear them. We have to wait till they're de-energized by the national grid. So in Abington, both of our utilities, electric and gas, are both national grid, and we have a great relationship with national grid. So just to give the Abington residents, and I think most of the other communities may be similar, but I'm not positive, an idea what goes on prior to these storms when we know that the storm is coming up, during the storm, and finally to get things back to normal. We actually begin meeting with National Grid, usually remotely or with teleconferences prior to the storm. They're already gearing up. They're already moving their resources throughout New England and actually the entire Northeast, depending on the severity of this. They're already going to begin to pre-stage their assets into place. I am not a spokesperson for National Grid. I have no stake in that, but I will give credit where it's due. We've seen this really for the last probably 12 years, working with National Grid on this. So they will begin to pre-stage assets to the best of their ability where they believe that the highest risks are going to be. Once the storm actually hits, they'll reassign those to, if the Cape gets hit more, or if southeastern Mass, like down by Fall River, gets hit, or if we get hit, they'll begin to reallocate those resources directly into the communities. So typically Abington, Rockland, Whitman, or even East Bridgewater will share different task forces of their crews. They're cut and clear crews, there's wire crews, there's pole crews. It's a massive operation that they do to get things ready. We're always told that, any winds above 35 miles an hour, they cannot get the bucket trucks up safely. So that can slow down the repairs and the restoration. We're aware of that. I know a lot of the residents are not, and it can be cumbersome. They will give us a heads up if we, they'll rate the severity of these type of a storm, a type 1 through a type 4, depending upon really the length of time for restoration should anybody lose power. The most severe is, 72 hours and above. And, we've had week-long periods with no power. That's difficult for everyone. But they are working with that. We, in turn, work with them. We have a liaison with them. They're actually assigned to specifically the Abington Fire Department from the gas side of National Grid. They'll reassign different people within their organization, and it's the same person. So he actually has familiarity with the town. We've had the same liaison for about 8 years. I'll get a text or phone call about 5 o'clock in the morning from Dino, who is our rep, and we're already gearing up for this. Sometimes he's actually at the station. A lot of times it's remote because it's actually kind of confusing at the station. And we're going to begin, we know our community specifically, and through that liaison, we're going to be letting them know, either critical infrastructure or, massive, we may have just one main road that if they could clear that, we now have access to 3/4 of our town. So we're going to prioritize that as an example. A lot of things go behind the scenes on that. So if anybody has questions, I can expand on that. But we really do work with them to restore as much of the town as quickly as we can. 9 times out of 10, the issue's not even in our town. It could be far away. It could be 2 towns over. It could be a main feed coming out of Pembroke that affects 4 towns downstream. A lot of times that's what's going on. It has nothing to do with Abington, but we're not getting power from a feed much, much further away. It gets frustrating, and we try to update the residents. The wildfires and the drought, the weather's the weather. Right now, we're out of the drought. Certainly, the water, actually, we're dealing with basements flooding, not as much the drought. The more construction in the urban sprawl that's coming south from the Boston metro area, we're actually building more into a lot of wildland areas in Abington that traditionally we used to have a lot of fires. We're actually beginning to develop a lot more of those. My career has seen massive areas developed with housing or commercial properties that we never had before. To be honest with you, the wildland threat's beginning to decrease somewhat because of we're tearing down trees, we're putting buildings in there. I'm not taking sides on that. That's just the facts. That's where we are. I'm just kind of putting that out there for conversation, I guess, if you will. We certainly still have brush fires, but the large areas of tracts of land, the wooded lands, Abington's losing a lot of that because we're developing it. So you're going to see that sprawl continue south, to Whitman, Hanson, Pembroke, Plimpton, like that eventually. So hopefully that helped. I'll go back to if there's any other questions, but I just wanted to speak a couple of things on those with.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you, John. I like that you both addressed, the severe storm risk that we talk about and drought and wildfire, because that was going to be one of the ones I brought up in case nobody had anything to say. I think we think often about those hurricanes, tropical storms, severe storms, winter storms, because we really visibly see and feel the impact of those. But sometimes with drought or even invasive species, I know Stephanie was mentioning that earlier in the chat, we don't see the impact until it's upon us, sort of thing. And so it's hard to tell if that makes them more or less dangerous. There isn't really a rating for that, but they're very good to think about. Anybody from, I mean, I will also invite Abington, but anybody from any of the other municipalities have any comments on how, what can we do to decrease the damages of these natural hazard events? I do have more examples, so I am willing to share. I'm going down the list alphabetically. So East Bridgewater, we're back with you. One of the 2015 actions for East Bridgewater was develop and implement a local flood mitigation dam management program, including inspecting, maintaining, and upgrading the Forge Pond Dam to present function, be helpful if I could read, and stormwater management potential.
And we've gotten some work done already during the intervening years. We have a study going on right now, in fact, for the control mechanisms for the Forge Pond Dam. But because we want to actually a more natural flow in between the two lobes that are west and east of Route 18 and how that's going to interact with downstream. But I know that the DPW has taken measures to reduce problems with the dam itself. Because obviously if you have a dam that's in ill repair, then you've got other problems than one that you've got in good repair.
Mm. Yeah, very true. Cheryl, if your mic is unmuted for other reasons, feel free not to.
Oh, I'm
but-
sorry.
okay.
Yeah, so I was looking to raise my hand. So this is mainly on a macro level. On a more micro level, there are definitely things that could be done that I'll put into the comments. But the other thing that, so I moved from Hingham. I had waterfront property and I actually sold before it was no longer of any value in 2014, 2015, because I was getting flooded regularly. And so I pay a lot of attention to FEMA and flooding. But one of the things we were talking about in Hingham, which I think is also applicable for some parts of Abington, I'm not sure about the other towns, is moving some of the electrical wires underground. And that's a huge project. And then the other concern that I have is like, well, if we're getting flooded, how does that help, right? So you have to put them in, flood-proof containers, and then they age and fail. But certainly, that's a potential to be explored, is to kind of when we have to redo our electrical and our cable and all our power wires, figure out if we can place them any more safely than being strung across the the kind of roads and highways on telephone poles. So that's one. And then the other more micro one that I just want to mention, and this could even exist and I don't know about it, is that I have neighbors that have diabetes. And I actually bought a generator because, of course, coming from a place where I would lose power and get flooded and I needed a sump pump running. So I have 2 generators that I can actually handle. They're the Hondas, the little portable Hondas. And I run my refrigerator and tell my neighbors that need medicine that they can put it in my refrigerator. But if the town had some grants for people who were disabled or lower income that had special needs for generators, not just people like me who are crazy, but but folks that had a medical need, that might be something that we could do on a very micro level, but would be very helpful to specific individuals that really, I'm a social worker, they get very, very agitated with the storms and thinking that they might die. Is a problem. People on respirators, people on oxygen, people with medicines. So I know the Board of Health are probably all over this, and I just don't know what we're doing. But I just want to put that out there. If any part of our grant opportunity includes the ability to apply for that.
Yeah, that's great input. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. And one thing I'll sort of respond to that. You hit the nail on the head. I think the public health officials and also emergency managers do think about that sort of thing. In terms of the hazard mitigation plan, one question that we like to ask as a follow-up is, if those services exist, do these residents know about them, right? Because it's one thing to have the emergency managers be ready with those lists and know which residents need the extra help and what door to knock on, but do those residents know that they'll get that knock? You know, I think that does get to your point about folks getting agitated or scared, and knowing that someone's looking out for them. So that gets to, from a hazard mitigation perspective, an outreach and education action.
Stephanie, go ahead if you have something to add to that. You may not anymore, but want to open it up.
I was just kind of going to build on what Cheryl was saying. I was talking with one of our Easton's longtime residents earlier tonight, who hopes she'll be able to make it for the meeting. But she was talking about how, you know, many years ago, she was trained to do that, to be a person who could transport someone in need during an emergency, and was wondering if those type of programs still existed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think if I'm not incorrect, I'm going to quickly scroll back to our capabilities. I just looked at this earlier. No, okay, yeah. So Stoughton, I know Sarah is here. She might be able to talk about it. She might not. But Stoughton has a community emergency response team, CERT for short, which is a great acronym. And I know that they work with a team of volunteers who get together and do those things almost to assist in the emergency services of the town. You know, trained in CPR, trained in you know, where are the most vulnerable populations, things like that, that I think it's a really great system for the town to implement.
And I think Easton has one as well, but I'll defer to our public safety representatives who are on the call, the meeting, to confirm that.
That's correct, Stephanie. We do have a CERT team. We also work with Director Kennedy and the COA for their buses to get people with needs or disabilities to our shelters. So it's kind of a tandem operation, but we have CERT will actually go door knocking to areas that have lost power for significant amounts of time. And then we have the buses to utilize to get them to the shelter if need be.
Great, thank you.
Another thing I'll add here is just one of the great benefits of doing hazard mitigation planning, as we all saw in the beginning of this presentation, is that we've got a really diverse team that comes together to be the committee. And I think there's so much value in having the discussion that we're having right now, where we've got folks asking questions relative to this plan that have to do with emergency management. And the fact that you've got people from public health and from councils on aging and from planning and public safety and emergency management in the same room, it's a great opportunity to learn about, you know, what your public safety officials do have on the books and how that does help to mitigate these hazards in a way. And of course, you know, what else do we need? So that's why we have this great mix of people here, and that's how this process works.
Any other thoughts that we have? At this point, I've fully lost the video, so I can't see any of you. So feel free again to just unmute yourself and start talking.
So this is Cheryl again. So I don't know where this fits in, if it's emergency planning or hazard mitigation, but I worry about water supply, just drinking water, potable water. You know, so during, and not that we've experienced or that I've experienced ever in New England, but that I'm watching around the country and around the world happening. So I just, again, just kind of put that out there. Do we need to worry about and include, and where does that fit? And is that like maybe in 10 years, or is that something we should start thinking about? You know, having drinkable water during emergencies.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say start thinking now.
Well, and again, it goes to really looking at your emergency management plan. I mean, two tracks here. First of all, where does your water come from, right? Are we on a town system? Are we on MWRA? And Emily talked a little bit about that earlier, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't recall for each of these towns. I think 2 of them are on private systems. And next question for me is, how many residents, if you're on a private system, is that 100% connection? Are some residents on their own wells? So then you veer again, what's the town's backup plan? Is there a backup connection plan? Is there a emergency or backup well? And then for the private residents who are on private wells, do they have a generator to run their pump if there's a power outage, prolonged power outage? If so, what about a drought situation? You know, in 2016, we had clients out in Western Mass. I was working with some smaller towns, and they were dealing with their wells running nearly dry, and at the bottom, it's not drinkable, right? So these are definitely questions to ask. And again, big macro scale response, it's emergency management and public health. But on the individual sort of mitigating the hazard for residents, we start thinking about backup power and backup sources. Paul, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, my thing is maintenance of storm drainage systems. You know, I work in construction. I work in municipalities all over the state. Some have really good plans. A lot of towns have, I'm not going to say their plans are bad, but their maintenance is lacking. You know, you get catch basins, especially this time of year, that are plugged up. The water can't go anywhere. The temperatures drop, stuff freezes, and accidents occur. You know, I actually 17 years ago, I actually used to work for Beta, and one of my jobs was going to certain towns and doing an assessment of their drainage systems to see how they worked. I just think it's huge to make sure that systems are clean and working the way they should be working. It'll help minimize flooding and make everything safer.
Yeah, absolutely. Great comment, Paul, and thanks for the pitch. We're sorry we don't have you anymore, but we do still do that service. DPWs have a major, I mean, they have loads of major responsibilities, and that's one of them. Oftentimes is going around and cleaning up those catch basins. And most DPWs they know where the pinch points are, they know where leaves collect, and they know where to go and clean out before storms. But you know, I could look out my window right now and tell you that it doesn't always happen in all places. That this is something that comes up a lot in hazard mitigation planning. Emily, I don't think this has been something that's been brought up yet for these towns, but Paul, you know, if you'd like to take this offline or put in the chat also, if you know specific places in town where maybe there is a bit of a concern, that would be helpful for the planning team.
Well, what I do usually, I'll get complaints from residents that they've seen flooding on their properties, being on conservation. What I'll do is I'll reach out to the DPW, and they'll usually go out there and take a look at it. If it's a matter of getting the truck out there and cleaning out the catch basin. Like I said, I mean, one of the big things, even after this plan is put together, I think with every town, is just communication. If somebody sees something after this plan is put together, if you see something, say something.
Sure.
That's all I have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I am going to give you actually the Easton example for an action that we have, because from 2015, Easton had an action that was compile and maintain a list as well as a map of all private drinking water wells in town. I think that's a pretty good action. Talking about what we were just talking about with the impact of droughts. and where water is coming from in town. So thank you, Charlie and Liz, also for expanding on where both Abington and East Bridgewater gets their drinking water. Any other thoughts?
And as we go on here, folks have other ideas for actions, the chat will remain open, so please feel free to contribute as we move on.
Absolutely. I want to give, equal time to each town. So I am going to finish with the Stoughton action from 2015. Stoughton had an action that said work with businesses and nonprofit organizations in town to develop emergency action plans that can be utilized in the event of a natural hazard. So I like to give different examples of some of the 2015 actions from each town. But yes, feel free to use that chat. And again, feel free to interrupt.
Yep, I was just gonna,
Yeah,
as a segue here, and then I'm gonna mute myself and stop cutting you off, Emily. But these plans, as Emily already mentioned, we like to update them every 5 years. That's what FEMA likes to see, and that's what keeps community eligible for certain grants. After 5 years, your hazard mitigation plan expires. But on this 5-year update cycle, we revisit the actions that were proposed 5 years prior or 4 years prior when you're starting to plan. And all of those are still on the table. And ideally, your community's completed some. We can check them off the list and they become capabilities. Most of the time, most of the actions haven't been completed for one reason or another. They might not be relevant anymore. They might be something that's just harder to get done. Maybe you've chipped away at it, right? But that's okay. That's sort of to be expected. And so the next part of the process we're going to talk about here is how we transition from that original list into the updated plan. And Emily, it's all you.
Thanks, Emily. You can interrupt me simply anytime. Yeah, so we moved from those 2015 actions. There were a lot of them, actually. I think it's on one of our next slides, but I believe there were like 73 regional actions identified in the 2015 plan, which is a lot to consider. But we actually consider even more than just that previous hazard mitigation plan. And we sort of try and translate the other mitigation actions, though they may not be identified as mitigation actions or goals specifically, actions that relate to hazard mitigation from other town plans, visions, workshops, things of that sort, to still try and check in. Where are we with the actions that we've identified? Do they need to be continued? Are they, like Emily said, no longer relevant? Do we need funding to continue them? And we use both those 2015 plans, the mitigation actions from other plans in town or even state plans, and our current ideas, what we were talking about this evening and what we'll continue to talk about with the committee and any other input that anybody has to identify a list of actions for each municipality. At the bottom row, you see here what we really try to identify in these actions. What is the action? Describe it. Who will be the lead and supporting implementing parties? Do we have to assign, sort of loosely use the word assign, the DPW to this task? Are they partnering with MassDOT on this task? Are we talking directly to the Conservation Commission or town administration, things of that nature? Who is going to be sort of directing this action? We also think about proposed time frame. Is this a long-term project, a short-term project? Does it need to be done immediately, or can it wait a little while? Things like the Forge Pond Dam, maybe we want to take a look at that now instead of later because of the state. But maybe items like our stormwater plan, updating that can be a little bit of longer term because we want to get a fair assessment of how our stormwater functions are working in town. We then, of course, everybody's favorite, want to talk about the estimated costs for each action. And this is where it really is important to consider these costs, because when each town is applying for hazard mitigation grants, it's good to have a sense of how much things will cost. And the other good thing to note is, where is that money going to come from? What are the potential funding sources in town, from grants, from the state, from FEMA, that we can rely on to complete each task? I do want to focus in a little bit more. Oh, 52, not 72. I was too excited. 2015 mitigation strategy. Again, a page with a lot of words on it. We had 52 regional mitigation actions, which is quite a lot. And beyond those regional mitigation actions, each town, each of those 15 municipalities in the old colony plan from 2015 had their own specific actions. You see Abington had 8, East Bridgewater 9, Easton 7, and Stoughton 21. Stoughton had the most out of any of the municipalities. I assume that's because they were very active in that plan. You know, some of the actions included improvements to the function of floodplains, increasing public emergency response communication, like we talked about a little bit earlier. Communication was a theme that sort of went across all of these actions identified, improving emergency and disaster response and recovery, decreasing damage to structures. And all of these actions had similar, different, varying town leads, fire departments, public works, planning and economic development departments. We see the range of departments that may be in charge or a part of implementing these actions. And then as well as the partners who may not necessarily be town related functions, consultants like Beta, private landowners, you may have to discuss with like privately owned dams, privately owned wells, things of that nature, MassDOT, NEMA, US Army Corps of Engineers, the utility providers that we also talked about earlier, National Grid. Who can we sort of loop in that can help us to create these or implement these actions? And I've used the word implement a few times because that's something we really want to do. We want these actions to be implementable. We want them to be affordable, want to have the resources at our disposal, and we want to get them complete because that will overall improve the resilience of each town. And so good to continue thinking about these actions and reaching out to those on the committee or directly to Emily and I. And as you can see also on the side here, these 2015 plans with some overlap amongst them broke down pretty well into these several themes that FEMA has identified. A lot of them were planning and prevention. So updating plans, creating plans, and we see property protection, natural resource protection is the lowest, has the lowest number of actions. These are from the regional actions, by the way. Emergency services was the second highest. So it's an interesting breakdown of what we see in those regional actions. And considering that they are regional actions, you know, it's most likely a bit more functional to be able to, you know, suggest updates to plans when you're focusing on a regional level rather than identifying each structure that needs assistance. So we hope that we can get even more specific in this plan. So we've gotten through it. We've assessed risk, established goals, and identified the projects and actions that will help to increase each community's resilience. Now we move on to the stage that actually we're technically currently in right now, updating and maintaining the plan. So, you know, this is sort of the last part of the plan update because we've already updated the plan and we'll continue to update the plan in the next 5 years. And we have a chapter called Implementation and Adoption, where we talk about, you know, how are we actually going to implement these actions? Who is going to be in charge of looking into these actions, hopefully on a yearly basis to check in on, you know, what's being completed, what's no longer necessary, what needs to be focused on more for our next iteration of this plan, and how can we best integrate this plan into the planning structures of the town, into maybe the town's comprehensive plan, any site plan review processes, town administration. So we're in this process right now where we are technically updating the plan, and then the maintenance of the plan will occur after this is submitted and adopted by each town, where we recommend a group, hopefully of community members and committee members who will then be former committee members to look into every year on the status pretty much of the plan in each community. until the next 5 years, where you will go through this process again to keep it up to date. So though it may seem like sort of the wrap up of the plan, it really is a cyclical process where we will be back here and considering these issues again in the next 5 years. I want to give you a sense of that maintenance, that implementation of this plan. Yeah, this is our sort of timeline, our next steps for this process. We hope to have a draft plan posted for review in March of 2023. Happy New Year, by the way, everybody. And then we will have a workshop that will discuss with the community this draft plan that we've put out to the public. That's Westwood, that's my fault. And we'll use those comments that we received to revise that plan and submit to MEMA and FEMA for their review, and hopefully receive comments from them as well to improve the plan, and then present to local select boards, local committees in April, and anticipate that FEMA conditional approval. They send us conditional approval. It's not technically approved until each town approves the hazard mitigation plan. And we hope to see that in May, June of 2023. On your right, you'll see a sample adoption resolution, something that your select board may use formally to adopt this plan. That's sort of the wrap up of the presentation portion of this meeting this evening. But I'd love to continue the discussion with you if you still have thoughts, comments, or questions. This QR code, actually, I know Emily put in the chat the link to the survey earlier. This also will take you directly to the survey. So maybe those of you who are watching later on, those of you who are watching now, feel free to scan that code or enter the URL into the internet use of your choice.
Emily, if you could go back to the last slide,
Yes.
I want to highlight a quick note on the process, and this is mainly for all of the core plan team members and hazard mitigation plan hazard mitigation committee members on the call here. This local adoption is extremely important, and too often communities get through a hazard mitigation planning process. They submit to FEMA, they get the FEMA comments, they address the comments, and then they get something called approval pending adoption from FEMA. And then they say, all right, we did it. That plan is not updated until you get this resolution adopted at town council or select by the select board or by your town administrator, depending on your town's political organization. So I just wanted to make that clear and make sure that everyone heard us say it, so that there's no question at the end of this process what the last thing that happens will be. We need this, and we need FEMA approval. And certainly, as we, your beta team will help to make sure that happens. But it's good for all of the committee members to know as well.
Agree. One last chance to scan the QR code before I stop sharing. Okay. So this is an opportunity for any of those final thoughts you might have on the process as a whole, any mitigation actions that you thought of while I continued talking at you that maybe you didn't have a chance to say, or even an area of flooding, in your community that you thought of, or where you've been impacted by drought, or if there was a tornado in your backyard that we don't know about. If anybody has any thoughts on that grand array of things, now is your chance to say them or ask questions. There's always a balance to how long I can wait in a virtual meeting. Sort of a strange affair. All right. Well, if you think of any of those things, I guess I probably should have put my email on the PowerPoint as well, but I'll type it in the chat instead because that's easier. Feel free to reach out to members of your committee, to either Emily or I. You know, we want to hear from you and we want to incorporate your thoughts into the plan, and we'll certainly incorporate the thoughts that we got here tonight.
For any members of the public here tonight who haven't been involved, if you do want to be more involved, reach out to that core planning team member in your town, and they may invite you to be a part of the committee going forward, or if nothing else, they will be your contact to provide more information and to make sure that you're kept apprised of the process as we go forward. Another reminder about that survey, the link is in the chat, and that remains open, and that's a great place for folks to contribute thoughts after this meeting as well.
Put that in there one more time. And as always, keep an eye out on each of your town's pages to see when we will ask for your input next. We'll certainly publicize that to get everybody involved. Until then, thank you for attending this evening, and thank you for all your input, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good to see everyone. Thank you.